different categories of workers and levels of exploitation. I mean, I think the systems govern everyone equally. However, it's very clear that low-wage workers, and we prefer the term low-wage to unskilled for human rights reasons, low-wage workers suffer the most exploitation and the most confiscation of passports and the most risk of trafficking, but there are cases across the spectrum of migrant workers in the Gulf at all wage levels. Obviously, if you make more money, you can afford, if you can get an exit visa to leave, you can afford your own plane flight. If you're a low-wage worker, you know, in a labor camp in Qatar and you make $180 a month with fees deducted and you owe a labor broker, you know, thousands of dollars back in Nepal, your ability to pick up and leave is really vastly limited. And so there is a difference, but it's a universal challenge for migrant labor in the Gulf. We had, if anyone else wants to comment on that, and then also recommendations for the home countries, as we call them. I'd like to start.
Yeah. I think recommendations for the countries of origin, and maybe others will have some things to add to this, but I think there are sort of three or four kind of key things that all of the countries of origin should be doing, and then there's a more overarching point. First of all, it's about regulation and enforcement of recruitment agencies and recruitment brokers. Recruitment brokers are sometimes the ones that the actors who are cause the most level of exploitation, because they will charge even for access to a recruitment agent, perhaps in the capital city, so ramping up the payment of recruitment fees. And again, it's about enforcement. Sometimes the laws are there in place, but the political will to enforce them is not. And part of this has to be an anti-corruption agenda, because there is often too many linkages between government officials and recruitment agencies. Every time you have someone who is taking a cut out of a recruitment process, you increase the risk of exploitation and you increase the cost that worker is having to pay. I think the increasing of resources in embassies in the Gulf is a very, very important point. Many of these embassies are completely overrun by the numbers of requests for help. And publicly addressing the issue. Again, Qatar's UPR as an example, if you look at the questions which were asked by the UPR, the Human Rights Review in Geneva, you look at the questions which were asked by the main sending countries, they were very weak. These are not countries that want to risk their relations. And the overarching point is, don't race each other to the bottom. Don't try to undercut other sending countries by trying to offer lower wages for your workers. Work together and actually use the clout you have as the providers of labour to the region, because labour is what Gulf countries need.
Yeah, I mean, from a practical perspective, I would just emphasize that our overwhelming focus is on the receiving countries because of the vast power imbalance, financial resource imbalance between sending countries and receiving countries, because the reality is it's a race to the bottom. When the Philippines banned its domestic workers from working in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and those list of countries have changed over time. Sri Lanka has tried to do that from time to time. All that happened was that the receiving country switched to another country. So where South Asia blocked its workers from going to a country, they quickly went to Ethiopia, Somalia, and other West African nations, East African nations rather, to recruit workers. And there is so much desperation, so much poverty, that all of the power is, virtually all of the power is in the hands of the receiving countries, and that is where the overwhelming obligation lies and should lie. And with respect to various levels of workers, starting with the fact that, again, the power imbalance makes the overwhelming amount of abuse and exploitation at the lower end of the spectrum, where probably 80% of the workers operate and reside. Many higher skilled workers, engineers, doctors, particularly from Arab countries, just this year discovered how vulnerable they were when they participated in demonstrations for the overthrow of Mubarak in the UAE. They were deported when there were demonstrations for certain action taking place against Israel. Shia Lebanese found themselves deported, and even though they'd been working there for decades and decades, and it came as a shock to many that they could be kicked out at any point. And just one final point, that even the Supreme Court justices, some of the Supreme Court justices in these countries are migrant workers themselves, and so it's very hard to expect that they are going to take a decision against the government when their own worker visa can easily be revoked and then shipped back to their countries, Sudan, Egypt, wherever the judges are imported from.
The International Labor Movement takes the position that we should eliminate recruitment fees for the reasons described on this panel, that you should not have to pay for the privilege of work. You're working and sharing your productivity and your skills with an employer, but you should not have to pay for that right to do that. And recruitment fees are and the recruiting agencies in that vast, despicable industry that starts in the home countries. That's where human trafficking starts. And so the home countries have an enormous responsibility to regulate that industry, an enormous responsibility. But the host countries have the resources and the capacity to make sure everyone is paid on time and that people are paid decent wages and decent work. They have the resources in the Gulf. There's really no reason to have people making $180 a month living in a labor camp owing thousands of dollars to some Nepali recruiter. That does not have to last. That situation should never be allowed to exist. I think we can take one more question.
Hello, my name is Ava Sadeghi, and I've had the privilege of working on the 2014 TIP report, specifically on the countries of Pakistan, France, Afghanistan, and the UK. And my fear is that this document is becoming increasingly political when you see countries like India on the Tier 2 watch list. So I was wondering if you could speak to how countries and governments perceive this document, especially in the Gulf.
I can't disagree with you that the document is becoming increasingly politicized. I just recently, the most recent report, Bahrain should have been relegated to Tier 3. It had been on the Tier 2 watch list for long enough. Statutorily, it was supposed to be on the put onto the Tier 3 list. It's still on the Tier 2 watch list because it obtained some sort of special dispensation from the U.S. government because of commitments that it had made, verbal commitments, or something like putting a plan together. We haven't seen any evidence of that plan, but presumably that plan has been presented behind closed doors. In the event that that plan actually exists, that's great. We're very happy. We're happy to see them making efforts here. But definitely the fact that countries like Bahrain, that are supposed to be going down to Tier 3, that are statutorily required to be going down to Tier 3, are not there yet, is definitely contributing towards the view, at least from NGO organizations, that the report is becoming increasingly politicized.
I think what I would just say is, and I don't feel I can fully speak to the exact point about the question about the politicization, but what I would say is, look, it is very important that there is public reporting on these issues, and there are very, very few instruments like this out there. So whether or not there may be an issue about exactly the way the tiers are put out, I think it's critical that it keeps happening, because there are very few reporting mechanisms like this that really put down, and the important thing is the detail that is in there, which doesn't feature anywhere else. The number of prosecutions, these reports often expose just how few prosecutions there are, for example, for trafficking, and as you say, often point out the disparity between states which focus entirely on one element of trafficking as opposed to another.
And I think it's very clear that governments in the region do pay attention to the report. There has been progress made in certain areas in certain countries in the GCC because of the pressure that came as a result of the report. But the challenge for every human rights and worker rights advocate in this room, and for us on the panel as international advocacy groups that focus a lot on the U.S. and the behavior of the U.S. abroad, it's a constant challenge for us to make sure that our government and our Congress prioritize human rights in diplomacy over other interests. That's a challenge for folks that work on the TIP report with their counterparts in other parts of the government. And it's a role that all of us here can play to try to make sure that human rights and trafficking are prioritized as core issues that we are advocating for globally through our diplomacy. With that, we've gone a little bit over time, and so I think